All right, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and welcome to the virtual reading group, in which we are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind, her last unfinished book. The book was supposed to be in three parts: thinking, willing, and judging. She finished thinking pretty well. Willing, a draft of at least, and then judging just had the title page in the typewriter when she died. But we are making our way now through volume 2 of this book on willing. And we finished a few weeks ago the first part on willing, which was called The Philosophers of the Will. So looking back at how these different philosophers begin to think about the will and largely repress it, because the will is this idea of freedom. The will is the place in man where we can do evil things, go against our reason, go against what is considered the law or good. And so these philosophers see will as a problem, and to the greatest extent necessary, seek to tame or neuter will by subordinating it to reason, or eventually in Hegel to history, and to the unfolding of a historical truth. This second volume, or second part of the volume on willing, is dedicated to the discovery of the inner man, or the question mihi factus sum, that I am a question for myself. This is looking at the rise of a particular version of an account of the faculty of willing. The idea here is that willing was not always considered to be a faculty of man. And so it emerged, and she's going to argue that for the most part, it emerges with the beginning of Christianity, with the Apostle Paul, and there's going to be a reason that it emerges at that time. Before we get there, though, in section 7 of this volume, which is called The Faculty of Choice, proeresis, the forerunner of the will, Arendt begins in a sense with Aristotle, and argues that the will, as Paul will discover it, as a faculty inside myself of inner freedom, has a forerunner, even though Aristotle never talked about the will in Greek philosophy and in Aristotle. Before we get there, just quickly at the beginning of this chapter, she references this idea of the metaphysical fallacies. And if you'll recall, in volume 1 on thinking, she makes a fairly big deal of the fact that the thinking ego, the I who thinks, the fact that I think, is a fallacy. It's a metaphysical fallacy. There is no ego that thinks, right? I mean, we're always an embodied appearing creature. There is no, abstract, withdrawn from the world thinking ego up there that thinks. And yet she says it's not simply a dogma or a semblance. It's not arbitrary. The fact that we continue to think of a thinking ego shows that there's actually something authentic about this fantasy, about this semblance. And it's caused, she says, not by dogmatism or something like that, but by an inherent paradox of human living as appearing and thinking. The fact that there's a paradox about that we human beings have this capacity as appearing beings to withdraw from the world and be alone with our thoughts in solitude. And it's that authentic withdrawal that she says it makes the thinking ego an authentic fallacy and not an inauthentic fallacy. So she brings this up here, obviously, with the suggestion that the willing mind is also a kind of authentic metaphysical fallacy, that there's something meaningful about it, even though it doesn't exist. Remember, this whole book is structured along the idea of that thinking and the life of the mind is about meaning, not about truth. So one way to think about this is both the thinking ego and the willing mind, are not true. They're not things that truthfully exist, but they meaningfully exist. And they are fallacies, but they are authentic fallacies. If the thinking ego is a fallacy that comes into being by an inherent paradox of human living as appearing and thinking, the willing mind, which she calls the mainspring of action, is a fallacy. It tries to answer the fallacy that on the one hand, the mind doesn't move anything, right? I can sit here and think and think and think and think and think as much as I can, but nothing outside of me is going to happen, right? The mind doesn't move anything. And even if I think and I move my hand, it's not clear, right? What the mind does to move my hand. And reason doesn't move anything. And so the question arises, what in the soul or what in the mind originates movement, right? It's an important, some meaningful question. It's a real question, right? That's why she's calling it authentic. And it's an inherent paradox of human living, which on the one hand, we seem to be not, our thoughts are in our thoughts and our wills are in ourselves, and yet we can do things out in the world. We can impact the world. And so this willing mind that does things, that moves things, that is the mainspring of action, she says, is similarly an authentic fallacy. She turns now to say, okay, well, we want to know what this will is. And she says, for the ancients, there really wasn't much of a will. They didn't talk about a will. But she says the closest we get is Aristotle. And so she does a bit of a reading of Aristotle on the problem of originating motion, on the mind originating motion. And Aristotle begins by taking up the Platonic division of the mind into three parts: the reasoning, the desiring, and the themos, the sort of one that brings it into action. And for Arendt here, at the beginning, you have a problem that reason commands, the desire inclines, and how do they relate? And that Aristotle begins by thinking that desire retains a kind of priority in originating movement. I mean, we don't move things through our reason, we move things through our desire, our want. And she does an etymology around the Greek word for desire, chrexis, whose primary meaning, she says, is from chorego, which indicates a stretching out of one hand, right? And so the desire is a kind of stretching out. I desire the ice cream. I stretch out my hand for the ice cream. And so that's where at the beginning, Aristotle will locate this sort of proto will, or this as he says, the forerunner of the will. And yet we don't want, and Aristotle doesn't want, us to just act out of pure desire, because desires are not rational and are often chaotic and can lead us to be full of regret for what we do when we act out of desire. And so we need to find a way to mediate between our desire and our reason. She thinks that largely for the Greeks, for Plato and Aristotle, this mediation is compelling and is governed by truth to some degree, namely that, especially in Plato, more so in Plato than Aristotle, but probably to some degree in both, the soul is such that the desiring ego, or the desiring part of my soul, is supposed to be subordinated to the truth of my rational soul, and that's not that's a kind of compulsion. Whereas in the development of the will, the rational part of my soul is not going to compel obedience from the desiring part of my soul, but it's going to seek to persuade me to act that way. And the beginning of Aristotle's inquiry into this is through his development of what he calls proairesis, which is a new term that Aristotle invents, and this is on page 60, in which we have a choice between alternatives. And so pro, which means forward, right? We sort of reach forward into a choice of two alternatives, but we choose one rather than the other. And she says here, the arcade, or the beginnings and principles of this choice, this is on page 60, are desire and logos. So what this choice is a combination of my desire and my reason. Logos provides us with the purpose for the sake of which we act, and choice becomes the starting point of the actions themselves. Choice, or proairesis, is thus a median faculty, inserted, as it were, into the earlier dichotomy of reason and desire, and its main function is to mediate between them. So proairesis is this idea that Aristotle determines of how we somehow can act based on both reason and desire, right? And that's sort of the key to this chapter. On page 61, she'll say at the bottom of the page, proairesis is the way out of the contradiction, right? Of the contradiction of reason and desire. It's somehow, in Aristotle's language and thinking, it's what mediates between these two things, reason and desire. And it's an attempt to bring them together. But it's still, as I said before, it's still under compulsion. It's not, it's still like your brain, because you're a rational animal, in Aristotle's language, you're an animal that has logos, your reason. You're still compelled to act and subordinate your desire to your reason, but proairesis is this way that your preferences do that sort of automatically. Which brings us to the and so this is what she means by it being a forerunner of the will. But on page 63, in the last few lines here of this section, What she says is that freedom becomes a problem, and the will as an independent autonomous faculty is discovered only when men begin to doubt the coincidence of the thou shalt and the I can. When the question arises, are things that concern only me within my power? So as long as I will, in the sense of I mediate what is reasonable and what I desire, as long as the thou shalt, the reasonable, and the I will do or I want are mediated through proeresis, we're not really free. There's not really a problem of freedom. It's just more of a logical puzzle. But once I start to realize that there are things that I can do, the I can, that are very different from what I should do. Once I begin to realize that in me is a struggle between what I can do and what I should do, then the question of freedom emerges, along with the question of evil. And that's and that moment in philosophical history and in the history of ideas, she says, is the moment of Paul's letter to the Romans, which is the subject of chapter 8 of volume 2. And so in Paul's letter to the Romans, she begins and says, what experiences caused men to be aware of their capacity to form this will, to know that they can say, and I can do this. I can do things that only concern me, that are within my power and that don't have to be good. And she says they aren't political experiences, they're inward experiences. And they were primarily the experience of the Apostle Paul's discovery, right? Which is that he wants to follow the law, but he also wants to not follow the law, right? And more often than not, this is Paul as Saul before he walks the road to Damascus. More often than not, Mr. Saul doesn't follow the law, right? In fact, he does what he wants, not what he should. And so he cries, I have become a question to myself, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Right? This is on 65 at the top. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate, which means I don't follow the law, which I want to follow as a good, rational Christian. But I do the very thing I hate, which is follow the will or law of my members, as he will call it. And that this discovery of an inner struggle that I have, on the one hand, the reasonable, rational law, and on the other hand, my will, and that I usually follow my will and not the law. And this feeling of sin and fallenness and freedom and evil is, and that it's up to me whether I follow the law or I fall into sin. This inner struggle is, Arendt argues, where we first encounter the will in the Western tradition. She says that sometimes she describes this as there are two wills in us, the will to the law and the will to sin. And sometimes she says there are two laws in us, the law of the mind and the law of the members. In either case, right, these are two different versions of the same struggle. the first thing we have to understand is that we suddenly realize that we have the power to not follow the law. And we only realize that when we are given the law and we realize we don't want to follow it. And that's why Christianity becomes the beginning of the will, because we impose the law upon ourselves and we say, I don't want to follow it. And so the law brings with it the counter law. The law brings with it the will. And the old law, which the Jewish law in this story, simply said, thou shalt do this. And you had to do it. But Paul changes it, right? He says, the new law says, thou shalt will this. What matters is not what you do, but what you will, right? And this is one of the great sources of medieval and early modern anti-Semitism between Christians and Jews throughout much of Western history, which is that the Jews say you just have to follow the law. It doesn't matter, what you think, what you will. And the Christians accuse the Jews of hypocrisy, right? They accuse them of following the law outwardly, but not actually being moral beings. And so the whole idea that, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you have to, you have prayers and regulations of your day. There's all these rules. It's the Bible is considered the laws, the book of laws. And you have to show your devotion through these rules. Paul and the Christians, claim that's hypocritical. You actually are not moral beings. You're simply following the law on the surface, but you're not following the law in your heart. And so what Paul says is what matters is not what you do, it's what you will. And that's where the source of your morality and your goodness lies, inside you. And only God can see that. And you have to protect the sanctity of your will and your heart. And that's where the law is. Within this Christian internalization of the struggle to be a good person, what we see is that the new law, what it demands is not simply fidelity to certain actions, but voluntary submission of your soul to God or to God's law or to the religious law. And this voluntary submission obviously carries with it the possibility of voluntary rebellion. And this is why I have become a question to myself, is Paul's great insight, because I can either stand in the law or fall, as Milton put it in Paradise Lost. This is an internal struggle that all of us have, for Milton and Paul as Christians, for them as, if they are, and I think as humans, that this is the human question of, do I voluntarily submit my will to God's law or do I not? And this is the beginning of the problem of the will that Arendt finds sort of in its concrete experiential foundations. All right, I'll stop there for now. Let's recall that we begin a conversation. There's two ways to engage. One is by using the hand raise function down at the bottom of your screen under reactions. And the other is you can engage in the chat. This was obviously super boring for all of you because there's not one hand, but that's fine. I can take a look at the chat. Is there anything in the chat that people have looked at, because I haven't had a chance to look at it, that you want me to respond to? Or I see a question from Fran. She's having mercy on me. Fran, go ahead.
Hi. I have a question to the beginning of chapter 7.
Yeah.
And I was wondering in what sort of construct does the idea of a human body part like the hand or the brain not being subject to change make sense? I think she talks about the
Yeah,
tool maker and the idea maker. Yeah.
yeah. So she makes this distinction here, both between the mind and the brain, and also then she analogizes the brain to the hand, um, as Fran is suggesting. And within this, um, she's doing so why is she doing this, right? What's going on here? Um, she says on 55, tracing the history of a faculty can easily be mistaken for an effort to follow the history of an idea, as though here, for instance, we were concerned with the history of freedom, or as though we mistook will for an idea. So the first move she's making is to say that will is not an idea, it's a faculty. Um, I've said over and over again that the faculty of the will and the question of the will raises the question of freedom, but it's not the same thing, right? It's a faculty. Now, this distinction between the mind and the brain is one that she makes in actually a number of her writings, probably most explicitly in the last chapter of Between Past and Future, on the conquest of space. But it's one that she comes to take very seriously, which is that the brain is simply, she says, look, if there were no distinction between the mind and the brain, then computers would be human, right? This is her part of her intervention into the artificial intelligence debate. And clearly computers are going to be able to outcalculate us, she's saying back in 1950s. Wasn't true then, but she knew it would happen, and obviously it's happened long since. And so she says, if we're going to make any sense of the way in which computers and humans are different, we have to separate mind and the brain. Then she wants to say the brain is a tool and the mind is something that originates thoughts and thinks. And then the next step she makes, and here's I think Fran's question is, which is to say on 58 and the 56 on the bottom, that the problem we're confronted with is the well-known in art history, where it is called the riddle of style. Namely, of course, I never heard of the riddle of style, but okay. She obviously citing it from somewhere, and she doesn't cite where she is. So if anyone knows, Vivian or anyone, you tell me. Namely, the simple fact that different ages and different nations have represented the visible world in such different ways. We radical different arts in different times and different cultures, etc. And this is the riddle of style. It's just different. It is surprising that this could come about in the absence of any physical differences. We're all human. Why do we see the world so differently in our art and in our styles? And perhaps even more surprising that we do not have the slightest difficulty in recognizing the realities that they point to. So even though we make art very differently than another culture and another time, we can recognize it. In other words, what changes throughout the centuries in the human mind, what changes throughout the centuries is the human mind. And although these changes are very pronounced, so much so that we can date the products according to style and national origin with great precision, they are also strictly limited by the unchanging nature of the instruments with which the human body is endowed. So what she's saying here is the brain is unchanging. It's an instrument. It's a tool. At all times in history, we have a brain and we think and we use that brain. And then she calls the brain power the most precious gift with which the body has endowed the human animal. The most precious gift which the body has endowed the human animal. But that unchanging, natural, precious gift that the body gives to the human animal is not the same as the mind. The mind, which thinks and originates thoughts and will and think. So the mind is where thinking and willing both will have its seat. And we shouldn't expect that throughout history, the mind will always be unchanging. The human mind changes. It's a shocking, intuitive thought. And part of the change is what she's now going to outline in this part of the book, which is how we went from a Greek world in which, you know, we thought of, the mind, there's reason, there's desire, and there's sort of some thing that connects them, proairesis or thymos for Plato, but no will. And then suddenly, with the rise of Christianity, the will emerges. And she says that's a whole new world. The human mind changes. It's still, but we can still recognize each, you know, it's not so change. The change is not so great that we can't recognize the Greek way of thinking and they can't recognize ours per se, but it changes. And so that's what she's here exploring. Was that what you were asking, Fran? I hope.
No, you
No.
explained everything that's changing, but you didn't say why she comes up with this idea, or like, what is this idea based on, that there's something in the world that is not changing. Like, can you tell me anything else that exists in the world that does not change except the human hand and the human brain according to this?
Roger, it may have something to do with her notion of riddle of style. So if you want to hear the only thing I can think of, I'm willing to say that because those might be linked.
Okay. Who is she citing on the Riddle of Style? Do you know?
I think that she's referring to Ernst Gombrich, another German Jew, because she would have totally been aware of Ernst Gombrich, even though I think he was in London. Because he wrote his very influential book. I think his most influential one was called Art and Illusion, which even when I was an undergraduate student was a kind of classic. And I think that this has to do, it's some notion of, you know, truth and reality, which is that I think, I mean, I don't really remember Art and Illusion very much, except of Gombrich's notion that artists, as varied as they may be, were all representing truth. So how was it then that in their truth, stylistically, it would look so varied and look so different? So that was a kind of conundrum. And I think that somehow this is what she's, So there's like a static notion of truth on the one hand, but when it's made physical, it looks completely different or something like that.
So your intuition is right. I just looked up the footnotes. It is Ernst Gombrich, Art and Illusion, which I should have looked up before, but I didn't realize it. That doesn't. I mean, I think it's helpful, but it doesn't answer, I guess, Fran's question, which is what stays the same. Why the brain and the body? I mean, I guess what we have here is a distinction between a man as artificer, right? What do we make? And man as sort of a given entity or body. You know, a distinction she holds, she explores in the beginning of the Human Condition and others. And remember, in the Human Condition, the whole idea is that it's not human nature, it's the human condition. It's that we are a conditioned animal. And as the conditions that we live in change, we change. but there are some things that, at least seem to stay the same, right? Our bodies, the earth, our brain in this case. Now, the whole premise of the human condition, and this is an interesting point for Anne, right, is that we are entering a period of human technological development in which it's increasingly possible for us to change our brains and change the world and inject nanoparticles and digitization into rivers and into the atmosphere and change it. And also change, the genetic code of humans and things like that. And so it may be that the brain, is not so unchangeable as she says here. In fact, I would say that reading this, knowing what she's written in The Human Condition, it seems like this is more of a rhetorical flourish. I mean, I would say that as she thought him. And by the way, if you read the Conquest of Space essay, right? I mean, this is again one of the problems she's raising there. I don't know why she feels the need to say that the brain is unchanging here, because I think that doesn't seem to fit with her own much more perceptive thoughts in other places. I think what she's saying, though, is that in general, the brain is a tool, and where we make meaning and ideas is through the mind. So it's a good point to raise. I think she's. Does she say the brain is unchanging? I mean, I know we said that. I'm just looking to see if she actually says that.
Yeah, she says it. She says it two times.
Where does she say it?
Like first, the part that you read, they are also strictly limited to the unchanging nature of instruments.
Mhm.
And above that, she says, without the never changing tool of brain power. So I was wondering why she said this, and then I thought like, oh, maybe she wants to set some sort of stage for the reason, that the reason doesn't move anything. So that there are things that, but yeah, it didn't make, it felt counterintuitive.
Can I add something here? Just brief.
Yeah, try it. Yeah, if you have something to say, Jeff.
I just wondered, it could be that it remains the same. It may be like in terms of comparative cultures, right? Because that's what I feel when we talk about style and that, it seemed like it was about among groups of people. So just saying they have something in common, which is the biology.
Well, I think that's true when she's saying about mind. I think it's also somewhat true of brain. I think this is one of those instances where I think she's overstated the case. We talked about this a lot. Arendt likes to make distinctions, make things, clear, make sure we understand the differences. And sometimes those distinctions can be heuristic, they can be helpful. But if you take them too seriously or not seriously, that's the wrong word. If you take them too inflexibly or something, they become problematic. Just like her distinctions between work, labor, and action. Obviously, all of these things bleed into each other. And so, I think the point that you can take from what she's saying, which is right, which is we have to distinguish mind from brain. And in general, brain is more of like a calculating tool, and mind is this changing, conditioned body where we come up with ideas and think and will and judge. But I think to sort of say brains are never changing and mind's always changing, I mean, I think that's too static, and I don't think she would hold on to that. But you can take it up with her when we all get to meet her later on. Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to go back to where you began and where she began at the beginning of chapter 2 with the term metaphysical fallacies. I think you were saying that for her, the thinking ego and the willing mind are metaphysical fallacies. And I had taken it in a somewhat different way, where the metaphysical fallacies are things like what she calls the two-world theory, right? The realm of being versus the realm of becoming, or the idea that somehow the thinking soul can be separated from the body and go off into the world of eternal forms. These are fallacies which nevertheless come from a genuine experience of withdrawal from the common world. But I didn't take her to be denying that there is such a thing as the thinking mind. It's just that it may have been misinterpreted. And similarly with the will, my impression is she wants to insist on the reality of the will against many metaphysicians and theologians who've tried to somehow replace it with determinism. So again, the will itself wouldn't be a fallacy, although of course it could be misinterpreted. So am I on the wrong track?
Well, I mean, right or wrong is, I mean, I think what you're saying, you know, let's put it this way. She does call the thinking ego a metaphysical fallacy, an authentic metaphysical fallacy. So if you want to say that it's not a metaphysical fallacy, that's not what she says. She, you know, on page 40,
where does she say that?
you know, I mean, it's going to be between, you know, the thinking ego and the self chapter on chapter 6 in volume 1 from page 40 to 43. You know, she'll say on 45 at the bottom of the section, the only relevant question is whether the semblances are inauthentic or authentic ones, whether they are caused by dogmatic beliefs and arbitrary assumptions, mere mirages, and disappear upon closer inspection, or whether they're inherent in the paradoxical condition of a living being, that though itself part of the world of appearances, is in possession of a faculty, the ability to think that permits the mind to withdraw from the world. So, and she's clearly thinks it's not just arbitrary, but an authentic semblance. She'll say it again on 47. To the philosopher speaking out of the experience of the thinking ego, just near the top of 47, man is quite naturally not just word, but thought made flesh. The always mysterious, never fully elucidated incarnation of the thinking capability. And the trouble with this fictitious being is that it is neither the product of diseased brain nor one of the easily dispelled errors of the past, but the entirely authentic semblance of the thinking activity itself. So is that?
Well, okay, thank you. So is the error to think of the thinking activity as if it were something immaterial and separable from the body?
Again, it's not an error. I mean, that's what I think she's trying to say is she doesn't want to say it's an error. She wants to say that it's not, you know, there is no, so to the extent, I mean, error is not a word I want to say, but I think to try and isolate the Kantian ding on seek, the thinking ego from her point of view, is to do something that's impossible, because there is no, you know, we can try and remove ourselves from the world, from my body, and I have a particular body and you have a particular body, and I have a gender and a religion and a race and a place, right? And to remove ourselves and say, I'm just some abstract thought. She says that just doesn't exist, right? We all are always going to be embodied in material in some way and appearing in some way. And so this is a metaphysical fallacy. And so, you know, you could say, oh, well, I've caught you guys up in a mistake. But she's like, no. It's much more complicated than that, because it's a metaphysical fallacy that that is deeply rooted in the paradoxical condition of a living being, that though part of the world of appearances and embodied and placed and gendered and raced and everything else, is still in position of a faculty, the ability to think, that permits the mind to withdraw from the world without ever being able to leave it or transcend it. And so, she doesn't want to say it's an error, but I do think she wants to say that it's to the extent you insist upon it as a thing, the thinking ego. Yeah, she says, yeah, that's a fallacy, but we understand where it comes from, and it's a helpful fallacy. Susan. So before I go, so just to finish up, on the question of whether the will is a fallacy or not, right? Which is the other side of the question that was just asked. Arendt doesn't. I think I can't remember if she returns to this later. I have to admit, it's been a while since I've read through all this. As we go through the book, we might want to ask that question again: to what extent the will, have philosophers and thinkers and Christians, and I'm just because of Paul and Augustine and Duns Scotus. Arendt is going to make, is basically making the argument that the will is largely a product of Christian thought, right? You look at almost all of the thinkers that she's, Augustine, Duns Scotus, Epictetus. It's going to have a very Christian ring to it. And so, to the extent the Christian tradition imagines that there is a willing subject, right, that can either will to stand with God or will to fall, I think she's going to name that similarly an authentic semblance. But she doesn't spend as much time on that, and I don't recall her really. We'll see, but that's the question that's being asked. And if you want to, as you read through the next few chapters, especially on Augustine, and then later on Duns Scotus, ask yourself, to what extent do Augustine and Duns Scotus imagine a will that exists, a willing mind that exists, and is that something that we could ever separate from our reasoning mind and our bodily mind and our bodily being? And is it a fallacy? And if so, is it an authentic fallacy? Right? That's the question that you'd ask. Susan.
So I keep coming back to this, what I find astonishing statement at the bottom of page 99. The will tells the memory what to retain and what to forget. It tells the intellect.
Oh, excuse me, just so I know, 99, because you're in a different edition.
Oh, I'm ahead. Oh.
Well, I don't know.
I'm in a different edition.
Are you on the Augustine chapter on 99?
Oh, Augustine, the first philosopher of the will.
Yeah, that's what we're going to read for next
time. Okay.
It's okay.
Well, I would say, for me, what's coming through though is the idea that it's the will that puts things into action. It's the will that chooses what to do. So, it just feels like that connects to, how something gets translated from what you're thinking into action.
That's right. And, to go back to the question we were just talking about, is the will, is there really such a thing, the will? Is it an authentic semblance, right? But yes, the will in Augustine is what tells us what to remember, and it tells us what to think, or it tells intellect what to, what to understand. So yeah, the will is a is a kind of willing mind that is for her, I think, an authentic semblance. And so that's why I said, if you want to pursue this, look at the Augustine chapter, and we'll get there next week. Or I don't think we meet the next 2 weeks, right? It's Thanksgiving, and then I'm away, so 3 weeks. But you'll have time to read it. It's a tough chapter. Bernie.
Hi, yeah, so I'm just kind of gathering my thoughts, and there's two things that bring the discussion on choice or paresis, and also her whole discussion on the thou shalt. To me, these two things bring to mind Kant's notion of negative representation in the Critique of Pure Judgment, and this which is again judgment. So there's this like tie here between willing and judgment, but which is the negative representation is a sort of paradoxical and self-reflexive figure that forces the mind to do something. There's an imperative, and he provides two examples of this imperative command, which is thou shalt not make graven image of that which is in the heavens, on earth, and under the earth. And also the veil of Isis. I am all that is, was, that was, and that will be, and no mortal has lifted my veil. He provides these two examples as a form of, this moral obligation, but it makes borders visible and calls into question those borders. So in the thou shall not, it brings in the possibility of that it shall, that, so there's a certain sense in which, I think will comes into existence or is prompted by the ability of choice. It's by, or a choice. So yeah, I mean, and again, she mentions Aristotle as choice being a medium faculty, but I don't know. It just seems like I don't actually have anything other than the fact that there seems to be that that the imperative is created by presenting an either or, and with that somehow then comes it's linked to judgment. I know she never got to actually write on judgment.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's helpful to think about Kant. I skipped over in my initial presentation. I skipped over the discussion of Kant on page 62 to 63. And so, Bernie, your comments and questions are, I think, raising an important point of, where Kant fits in, but more is, what is this nature of choice, and to what extent it is a compelled choice versus one extent it's a free choice. And
right,
as I was saying before, she sort of reads Aristotle and Plato as still, even along the idea of choice with proairesis, as still being a compelled choice, whereas starting with Paul, we realize that things are within my power to do things differently, and then the choice moves from compulsion to persuasion. Kant, is an important figure in this because, he imagines this idea of the categorical imperative acts such that the maximum of your actions or my actions accord with the universal law. And what's absolutely core to the Kant categorical imperative is that it's self-legislation. It's not imposed on me from outside. It comes from inside. I must act such that the max of my action accords with the universal law, because I am a rational being, and therefore I must submit my being to my reason. And so, what she says is the will in Kant, this is on 63, is in fact practical reason, much in the sense of Aristotle's nous practicos. It borrows its obligatory power from the compulsion exerted on the mind by self-evident truth or logical reasoning. So on the one hand, it's still compulsion. This is why Kant asserted time and again that every thou shalt that does not come from the outside, but rises up in the mind itself, implies a thou canst, that you can't actually go against it. What is at stake is clearly the conviction that whatever depends on us and concerns only ourselves is within our power. And this conviction is what Aristotle and Kant basically have in common, although their estimation of the importance of the realm of human affairs is greatly variance. So I have to admit, I'm a little surprised by her reading of Kant there. Kant does make freedom, autonomy, the center of his moral philosophy. And I would have thought she would therefore have read Kant more on the side of people for whom the thou canst doesn't have to conform to the thou shalt. I mean, I think the whole point in Kant is that for human beings, unlike for God, we can stand or fall. He's a very Christian thinker in that way. And I have to admit, I'm a little, and that's the way Arendt usually reads Kant, in my understanding as well. So I don't understand in this case why she says that for Kant. And I don't know where in Kant he says that thou shalt implies that thou canst. I mean, yes, thou canst, but also thou canst not. And that's why freedom is an obligation and law is an obligation and not something that just you do naturally like God does or an angel does. And that's when freedom becomes a problem and the will as an independent autonomous faculty is discovered only when men begin to doubt the coincidence of the thou shalt and the I can. And I think clearly Kant's understood that didn't have to coincide. So I think I'm not entirely sure how to interpret this, but I'm pretty sure where it ends up, which is that Kant is similar to Aristotle in their structure, but he eventually comes to embrace freedom as the core of voluntary submission to the law. Now it's voluntary, and yet what he will argue, and this is maybe where he's closer to Aristotle, in order to be human, we have to do it. We can't be human if we don't submit to the law. And that may be where the thou shalt and the thou canst come together for Kant. So I don't know if that helps, but hope so. Stephen.
Thanks, Roger. I'd like to go back to page 71, the final sentence in the top paragraph, where Arendt claims that Paul opened up a veritable Pandora's box of unanswerable questions and plagued with absurdities any strictly Christian philosophy that would follow. Wouldn't it be fair to say that it's equally a problem for secular philosophy and ethics? Once Paul has opened up this Pandora's box, everybody has to deal with it, regardless of their religious orientation, and that the absurdity perhaps is in the human condition, and Paul merely uncovered it. It was there all along. Would that argument have any traction with Arendt, or would she be saying that the best thing overall would be to disentangle ourselves from the Christian tradition and start fresh?
Yeah, I think that's the right. I mean, I think that the absurdities comes from the fact that we realize that man, as I just said in that last paragraph, man can do what we want, and that the I can, that things that concern me are within my power. And yet somehow we still insist that somehow the world follows God's, rational plan. And this leads to the absurdities of of someone like Leibniz, for example, saying, oh, well, he must have, we can't know God's plan because it's so complicated, but if we all knew it, it would be the best of all possible worlds. And the theodicies that emerged through that. And then the other answer is the answer Job gave, right? Which is that, who are you to question God? So I think the inclination is to say, if we're gonna, once we've changed our mind, to go back to Fran's initial question, and we enter this world where we believe we can, we have the power to fall or be free, we should confront the reality of the world we live in, which is that we live in a world of freedom and evil, and try and live in that world and deal with it without the need to submit to a kind of Christian or religious law, and that's where we end up with these absurdities. I mean, it's to live without banisters, if you want to put it in another register.
Yeah, a very Arendtian way.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Fran, do you have another question, or was there that hand up from before?
I have another one. Can I ask?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I really liked chapter 8, reading about evil and good, and doing evil and wanting good, and getting this all mixed up. And it reminded me of the beginning of the introduction of the book, where there's this quote that has been to me like very inspirational, where Hannah Arendt asks, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against it?
Yeah.
And then I always took this kind of like a guide throughout the book. And then when I came to this quote, why not do evil that good may come, I suddenly asked myself if this thinking activity could also condition man from doing any good. Like, could the thinking activity be among the conditions that make man abstain from good doing, from being virtuous?
Well, if thinking is a 2-in-1, her argument for the for the first thing, that could it be one of the activities that conditions us against evil, right, is that we have to live with ourselves, and to the extent we have to live with ourselves, we want to think from the perspective of others and question ourselves, and eventually we need to live with ourselves. But there are people, right, who are perfectly able to live with themselves, having done evil. Now, is there anything in what Arendt calls thinking that says that that's not thinking, or does thinking free you from? Can thinking also be a kind of nihilist thinking? She does say that thinking itself is dangerous, right? There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. And the reason is that thinking flirts with nihilism, because thinking undoes all limits and undoes all morals, and I mean, it questions all limits and all morals and all banisters and all metaphysics. And so there is a kind of danger in all thinking that it runs amok and destroys everything without rebuilding anything. And to that extent, yeah, there is a danger in thinking. You know, her hope is that thinking remains connected to the world through bodies and through metaphors and through the apparent world, and that we don't go off into a kind of abstract nihilistic thinking, but remain committed to the common world and common sense. And in that point, we then have to live with ourselves in the world. But it's possible that thinking can go off the trail, off the tracks. And she's very aware of that. And it's at that point that thinking and willing become almost indistinguishable. That's going to be the Nietzschean move, which we'll get to much later in the book in chapter 14 or 13 and 14. But the Nietzschean move is going to basically be say that all thinking is willing and willing is thinking. And I will, therefore I am, instead of I think, therefore I am. And at that point, there's no limits on what I will. And that's going to be the, I think that's very much what I think that's what you're referring to. And that's the danger of thinking outside of the Christian or the religious or the moral or the ethical or the worldly banisters, whatever they are, is that it can quickly go bad. Are there any questions in the chat that people want me to address, or you want to address, or do people have comments? We seem to be, I seem to have cowed you into silence. Jeff?
Maybe I'll leave my camera off anyway. It's definitely occurring to me while I'm reading this, but it's not actually in here, so that's why I was reluctant to bring it up. But I just think this idea that I mean, I like how you explained it, and I think that's the conventional explanation that the will is there to the Augustine invents the will, although we haven't gotten to Augustine yet, is the is, to make people responsible for their actions. But the feeling I'm getting in here, it seems like it's lurking in the background. I wonder if it's going to come up, or maybe it's just an alternate interpretation, that the will was the way to give everybody the chance to be the leaders, the masters, the ones who make the laws. Yes, you can make the law. You make the law for yourself. And look, you've already got a resistant subject, which is to say, desire, the passions. It isn't an empty job, right? It's a hard job to keep yourself in line. But then when you dominate yourself, your passions, then you can feel like a leader, like I am. So that seems to be, it always seems to be in the background, but I don't think she's said anything to that. But is it coming up, or does it even make sense?
The idea, I take it to be the idea that there's a certain joy in willing because we're in control. Is that the idea? Or a sense of that
Right.
what-
Yeah. People aspire to will because they're used to having people handing the law down to them. That's where we started, right? The external concept of
Yeah.
the law.
I think that's going to be discussed in the next chapter on Epictetus. So on page 79, he'll say this faculty of turning away from the outside, turning toward an invincible inside obviously needs training, right? And on 81, it is only when willpower has reached this climactic point where it can will what is and thus never be at odds with outward things and thus can be said to be omnipotent. So it's this omnipotence, this feeling of power that I think you're alluding to.
Yeah. It kind of goes with Epictetus. Yeah.
And it'll come back with Nietzsche as well. Yeah.
If no one else has another question, can I ask my third question?
It's fine with me. Does anyone else want to jump in? I'm happy to let Fran ask. I just don't want to exclude other people who have questions. This is a chance maybe for someone who's been waiting for weeks to ask a question. Here's your chance. All right, Fran, love to hear yours.
Okay, so page 56. Could the mind acquire new faculties in the course of history? This question, which I think is very interesting, made me realize that I actually do not know what the faculties of the mind are supposed to be. And then I Googled it, faculty of the mind, and all kinds of stuff came up. So I'm curious, what are the faculties of the mind?
Well, I mean, here she's obviously referring to will, right? The argument here is that, as I think we said earlier, the argument here is that the will is one of those faculties of the mind that emerged largely coeval with the rise of Christianity and Paul. And that while there was forerunners of the will in the Greeks and in Romans and other places, the will, wasn't really a faculty of the mind until Paul identified it. Thinking is another faculty of the mind. Now it's one that at least has been known for longer, all the way back to the Socrates, if not further. But we could ask to what extent thinking changes over time. And then judging is another faculty of the mind. Those are the three that I think she's most concerned with here. Obviously, those are the three faculties of the mind that she's writing about. Are there others? I mean, yeah, calculating is not, that's brain power. Are there other?
I somewhere read like perception, which I was not sure, then memory. I don't know.
So perception, I believe, is going to be more like along the lines of what she calls brain power. Memory is an interesting one. Memory, the question is, on the one hand, you can make memory into simply a power, but you could also make it into a faculty of the mind that decides what to remember and what not. And depending on how you read memory, it could go either way. But I mean, the three main ones, I don't know what other philosophers or thinkers say, but for Arendt, the three main faculties of the mind that she's talking about are thinking, willing, judging.
Thank you.
Yep. Stephen.
Yeah, just on Fran's point, Roger, I'm a broken record on this, I realize, but Arendt could make her case without I think using the term faculties, my reading of contemporary sources is that a lot of philosophers influenced by psychologists, I guess, talk more in terms of functions and capacities and don't kind of hypostasize some elements in the way that the word faculty seems to require. So that might be a way to preserve Arendt's argument, but not tie it to perhaps an outmoded way of conceiving the brain, although I realize at the same time that the brain and the mind in some modern psychological discussions do have areas of where certain kinds of action take place. But I just find the term faculty creates a bit of a barrier to something about the activity of the brain. That's just an amateur's opinion, though.
Do we have any Latinists on the call? I mean, I'm going to assume that faculty is going to come from facere, but does anyone tell me if I'm right or wrong? Anyone have a Google dictionary or a dictionary, Latin dictionary? In any case, if faculty comes from facere to make, you know, these are the faculties, these are the parts of the mind that can, in a sense, make or create or build a world, to artifice a world. Is it, anyone look it up?
The etymology comes from facile, from easy to do. So it basically has to do with habits, things that we learn that we do well because we do them a lot.
Well, facile, we say easy to do, but it's facere. It's a kind of fabrication. It's making. And so these are the things that we do and make. So I don't have a whole lot of, I'm not gonna, I mean, the word faculties, I grant you, probably strikes many of us as a bit off-putting, but I think she's using it because what was the alternatives that you offered? The capability? No.
Yeah, capacity of function.
I don't think it's just capacity or function. I mean, that's the distinction she's making between brain power and mind. And thinking, willing, and judging are part of the mind, not brain power. And so there are ways of building and creating a world. So yeah, I'd stick with faculties. But, I mean, I don't have a huge amount to say on that off the top of my head. All right. If there's no more questions, or if there are, I'm happy to answer one or two more, or talk about them. If anyone wants to say anything. Jeff, is that a new question?
Well, it's the continuation of the faculty idea. This has come up in my small group too, I think. But I think what's happening, starting with Kant at least, and probably before, is this sort of return to the medieval conception of faculties. So I think that might be another reason for the choice of word. In opposition, although Kant was not an anti-rationalist, but you know what I mean? It was sort of recalling and said, look, we had other ways of looking at life before science, and so it's basically a throwback to the medieval thinking, which of course is what she's discussing mostly here. But I'm just saying, why that term got chosen.
Right. No, I think that's true too. All right. Oh, Greg.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I wonder if we're being a little bit more intellectual about this whole thing than Arendt herself is, right? And this is one thing that's different about the book, The Life of the Mind. It's much more explicitly intellectualizing rather than sort of going at a pragmatic problem. What does it mean to lose politics, human condition? And by that, I mean, she's trying to ask the question of how do people do evil, right? So she starts with Eichmann, and through the whole book of thinking, you know, it's that issue of reaching agreement with yourself based upon, I presume, how you live in the world. And that if you have any consciousness of that dialogue, you're going to want to act in the world. So isn't willing then, you know, where she's leading us, and I almost feel like she distracts by going too much into all these philosophical histories. She's leading us to saying that we have to act in such a way that we can resolve that inner dialogue, right? I mean, when I look at it sort of pragmatically, and I think Arendt is much more of a pragmatic thinker in that regard. She's not just, you know, wanting to advance knowledge and this kind of thing. She's just trying to find clues in the history of philosophy where she can find it. But ultimately, the question about willing is, how does this help us resolve that internal dialogue? Or I guess I'm framing that as a question, but I sort of feel like we're kind of, a lot of issues get clouded over when we try to figure out what, you know, Paul meant and Kant meant and all these things. But that's just a question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a nice question. I think it's a good general question. And what I'd say is, the part of the book that was going to do what you want to do, which is how to resolve what to will and what not to will, was the part on judgment, which she didn't get a chance to write, but we may read some of the precursors to the chapter after we're done with this. But, you know, willing, the chapter, the book, the volume on willing, I think really is a volume on a problem. And the problem is freedom and evil. And willing is a problem. And will is a problem that enters the world when, first with a Christian, we begin to question the law and say that the law carries with it a counter law. And we begin to realize that the law is oppressive, and we want to follow the law, and yet we don't. Even if we follow it in hypocritically, like the Jews did, right? According to Paul. Rarely do any of us, never do any of us follow it truthfully in our heart, willfully. We always stray. And eventually we come to learn, right, as she says, that it's in our power to fully forsake the law and embrace our will. And that's a kind of nihilism. So I think the chapter on will is not about resolving this, but delving into the problem.
You don't see it as about acting?
Well, will is the faculty to motivate us to act. Yes, absolutely. But you know, and so in discovering that faculty of the origination of action, we discover it when our actions become problematic, become you know, a question of, do I follow the law or do I reject the law? Do I rebel or stand, in Milton's frame? And then freedom becomes a problem. So I think, yeah, I mean, she obviously wants us to think about how to act in ways that are not evil, but that part of it, right, is going to come back in the chapter on judgment. I mean, I mean, obviously, all of these thinkers want us to say, don't do evil. Paul says you should follow the law. You should live in God's, law. Augustine is going to say it. They're all going to say it. But the issue here is more the problem than any of these philosophers offering the solution that she embraces. For her, the question is going to be, how do you make these judgments that will encourage the will in the direction we want, absent metaphysical pillars, absent the tradition.
Okay, let's move on. Other people have their hands up. I'm still very unsettled about what's going on in this part of the book. But anyway, good.
Okay. Anne, I think this is your first question. I'll let you ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Could you clarify how you're using the term law?
Well, yeah, I mean, in this chapter on Paul, the law is God's law. So the rational law, or in Kant, it would be the rational law. In Christianity, it would be God's law. And so when he says on page 68, when she says, Paul, it is true, does not discuss it in terms of two wills, but in terms of two laws, the law of the mind, so the rational law, God's law, that lets him delight in the law of God in his inmost self, and the law of his members that tells him to do what in his inmost self he hates. So it's there's two laws, right? The law of the mind and the law of the members. And there's two wills, the will to the law and the will to sin. And she sees them, what Paul sees is that one law implies the other. If you have a law of the mind, it immediately makes you aware of the law of the body, the law of the member, right? And that's sort of Paul's insight here.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
My question really is around where in the will it is possible to, where the will can become a kind of critical force rather than just following what is given. It's thinking through what is given in relationship to your circumstances, for example. And it just seems to me that Paul's understanding of the will is very simple in that respect. It's either the given or it's the evil self that needs to come to terms with what is given.
Yeah. I think Paul's struggling with what he sees as a basic problem, which is that he knows he's supposed to do one thing and he says he wants to do it, but he keeps doing something else. I mean, I assume we've all been in that situation. So it's a simple problem, but it means that it means that there's a more the more nuanced view is that even the law therefore carries with it a recognition of a counter law. You wouldn't have the law without the counter law. And so the will is presupposed by the law in Paul's theology. You can't have the law without a rebellious will.
Thank you.
Yeah. Steve, do you have a quick question or not?
I'll throw it out there. In response to Greg Feldman, you talked about judging, and I think in the context of judging the consequence of future actions, weighing the risks or probabilities or whatever. But do I understand? I recall Arendt saying judging is the retrospective faculty of these three faculties that we're talking about. And I guess does she bring that in? To me, judging is kind of implicitly retrospective, in the sense of a legal judgment, is always a determination of the consequences of past acts. But of course, it always looks, or at least in tort law, for instance, when we're talking about negligence, as to the requirement the law makes of us to look to the future and to consider the consequences of action. So does judgment play both sides, past and future, or am I just getting things too complicated here?
Well, you're right that judgment is generally a judgment of history or of the past. And so we judge we can judge what's happened. We can also judge what we've done in the past or our wills in the past. So I think you're right about that. And will, as we've said, is sort of what reaches out into the future. But how do you, the problem with will is that it's free. So what are the standards, if any? So if you go back to page 213 in the postscriptum from the volume 1. Second paragraph of the prescriptum. But this last attempt to defend the thinking activity against the reproach of being impractical and useless does not work. The decision the will arrives at can never be derived from the mechanics of desire or the deliberations of the intellect that may precede it. So the will is never going to be predetermined by reason. The will is either an organ of free spontaneity that interrupts all causal chains of motivation that would bind it, or it is nothing but an illusion. So that's the problem that she's trying to explore in the section of will, the problem of freedom. She says on 214, the next page, I shall follow the experiences men have had with this paradoxical and self-contradictory faculty, starting from the Apostle Paul's early discovery of the will's impotence, right? That we don't do what we want, we do what we do, or what I hate, and going on up till Nietzsche's will to power. So you might want to go back and look at that paragraph. Take a look. All right. Thank you guys very much. It was a great conversation. Got a lot of good thinking going on, I can see. For scheduling reasons, we don't meet for another 2 weeks, so I'm sorry about that, but maybe it's a time for you to read again, look through it. We're gonna read chapters 9 and 10 of this section on December 10th. Very much looking forward to talking to you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt and enjoy your holiday. Happy Thanksgiving.